I need to tell you something before I start. I was there, I saw it all, and I still can't fully explain it, not in a way that makes clean sense, not in a way that fits neatly into a report or a diplomatic briefing. I've tried. My superiors have asked me 3 times now to submit a formal account. 3 times I've started it. 3 times I've looked at the blank page and thought, how do you write something like this without it sounding like you made it up? So I'm going to tell it the way I remember it, from the beginning, the real beginning. My name is Corvin D. Hess. I served as a third-tier protocol attaché aboard the sovereign vessel Ethon's Reach for 11 years. That's a fancy title for something simple. I made sure the right people sat next to each other at dinners. I made sure gifts were culturally appropriate. I made sure nobody accidentally insulted a Velundran dignitary by using the wrong honorific. Boring work mostly. Important work, but boring. I was 43 standard years old when the marriage negotiation began. I had attended, by that point, 67 formal interspecies diplomatic events. I thought I had seen everything. A Marthok delegation that communicated exclusively through scent glands. A Cassivian prince who showed up to his own betrothal ceremony 3 days late because he had been meditating. An Orvali matriarch who ate the centerpiece flowers during the opening address. I thought I had seen everything. I had not seen anything yet. The Ethon's Reach was a vessel built for exactly this kind of mission. She wasn't a warship, not primarily anyway. She was a diplomatic transport, which meant she was enormous, expensive, and almost offensively beautiful. Every corridor was lined with rotating displays of cultural artwork from all 12 worlds. The dining hall could seat 400 beings from 6 different atmospheric requirements simultaneously. The whole ship smelled, depending on where you stood, like either fresh rain on a Terran forest or the sweet mineral mist of a Velundran highland dawn. We were en route to the Vethric Neutral Station, a midpoint between human territory and the Velundran sovereignty, for what the official brief called a preliminary accord of alliance establishment, which was diplomatic language for, we were trying to figure out whether humans and Velundrans could stop being politely suspicious of each other and start being something more useful. The Velundrans are, and I say this with enormous respect, the most beautiful species in the known galaxy. This is not my opinion. It is a recorded empirical observation made by every other sentient civilization that has ever encountered them. They're tall, averaging somewhere between 2 and 2.4 meters, with iridescent skin that shifts color based on emotional state. Purples and blues when calm. Warm golds when happy. Deep crimson when angry, which you do not want to see. They have 2 sets of eyes, the outer pair, which they use for standard vision, and the inner pair, smaller and slightly luminescent, which detect electromagnetic fields and what they call resonance imprints. Which, as best as anyone can figure, means they can sense the emotional state of the people around them. They are, in short, a species that is genuinely difficult to lie to. The Velundran delegation was led by High Counselor Verath Saln, a male of approximately 300 standard years, ancient by human measures, middle-aged by theirs, with deep violet skin, and the careful, measured manner of someone who has seen entire political systems rise and collapse. He had 23 people with him. Aides, bodyguards, cultural interpreters, and 1 person who wasn't introduced in the initial manifest. 1 person I didn't notice at first because she was dressed like an aide. Princess Silerin Vel of the Sovereign House of Velundra. Second daughter of the Velundran Empress. There theoretically to observe. I found out who she was on the 2nd day. One of the Velundran cultural interpreters, a small, quiet woman named Thessa, pulled me aside in one of the corridor alcoves and told me, with the extreme calmness of someone delivering a very large piece of information, that the person I had been seating in the 3rd row at diplomatic sessions was actually the heir-adjacent princess of the most powerful non-human civilization in the known galaxy. I stared at her for a long moment. Why, I said carefully, was this not in the manifest? Thessa tilted her head. The princess wished to observe without formal acknowledgement. I stopped, breathed. That's not standard protocol. No, Thessa agreed pleasantly. It is not. I spent the next 20 minutes in my office quietly panicking before I pulled myself together enough to update the seating arrangements and notify my superior, who was Deputy Ambassador Lyra Voss, a woman of extraordinary composure who received this information with a single long blink and then said, "Well, that changes things." It did change things. It changed a great many things. The human delegation was led by Ambassador Kale Maris, who was exactly what you'd expect an ambassador to look like: silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with a voice that had been professionally trained to sound trustworthy. He was good at his job, efficient. I liked him well enough, though we weren't close. He'd brought a staff of 31. Aides, advisors, military attaches, because diplomatic missions always have military attaches, even when everyone pretends they don't, and one person who, like the princess, stood a little outside the obvious structure. His name was on the manifest. I'd read it. I hadn't thought much about it. Calder Voss, Civilian Cultural Liaison, Special Assignment. He was sitting at the far end of the table during the first working session, in a chair that was technically too far from the main table to matter diplomatically. He had a data pad. He made notes on it. He didn't speak. He was present the way furniture is present, acknowledged by no one, part of the background, unremarkable. I remember noticing him the way you notice a small stone on a path, just for a second, just enough to note that he was there. He was, I would guess, somewhere in his mid to late 30s. Average height for a human male, which meant he was noticeably shorter than every Velundran in the room. He had light brown hair, worn a little longer than regulation military standard, which told me he wasn't active military. He had the kind of face that doesn't immediately tell you anything, not handsome in a striking way, not plain in a forgettable way. Just a face. Calm. Still. The eyes were the only thing that caught me slightly off guard because they were very dark and very attentive in a way that didn't match the rest of his unremarkable presentation. But I didn't think about it. I had seating charts to adjust. I had an undisclosed princess to quietly insert into appropriate protocol. I didn't have time to think about a civilian cultural liaison sitting at the wrong end of a table. I should have made time. The working sessions over the first 3 days were exactly what you'd expect. Careful. Measured. Everyone saying the right things in the right order, nobody committing to anything specific. The Velundrans were polite and thorough. The humans were polite and slightly nervous, which, to be fair, is a reasonable response to being in a room with beings who can sense your emotional state. High Counselor Saln asked questions about human governance. Ambassador Maris answered them. There were cultural presentations. Humans presented a summary of Earth's history, which the Velundrans received with their characteristic careful attention. The Velundrans presented a summary of Velundran societal structure, which the humans received with visible awe because Velundran society is genuinely extraordinary. Princess Siluran sat in the 3rd row and watched everything. She asked no questions, she made no contributions. She observed with the precise, contained attention of someone who was there to gather information, not provide it. I noticed her properly on the 2nd day. I mean, I noticed her as a person, not just as a scheduling problem to manage. She was, I don't want to say beautiful because that word is so insufficient for a Velundran of her lineage. She was about 2.2 meters, with skin the color of deep twilight sky, that particular shade of violet blue that the highest Velundran houses are known for. Her inner eyes were slightly more luminescent than most Velundrans I'd encountered. A sign, Thessa had mentioned quietly, of exceptional empathic sensitivity. She watched everything with those 4 eyes and gave very little away. Except once. On the afternoon of the 2nd day, during a brief recess, I was carrying a stack of revised cultural notes across the room, and I nearly walked directly into Calder Voss, who was standing at one of the side windows, looking out at the stars. I sidestepped, muttered an apology, and kept moving. When I glanced back, just reflexively, the way you do, I saw the princess watching him. Just for a second, just a flicker. Her outer eyes were on him, and her inner eyes, the ones that detect resonance, the ones that sense emotional states, were faintly, almost imperceptibly, brighter. I noted it, filed it somewhere in the back of my mind under things to revisit when I have time. I did not have time, not then. On the evening of the 3rd day, we held the first formal social event, a dinner in the Ethon's Reach main hall, full atmospheric accommodations, 400 settings. These dinners matter enormously in diplomatic context because they're when guards come down, slightly, and actual relationship building can happen. They're also when my job is most intense, because I'm managing approximately 400 seating decisions simultaneously while trying to anticipate any cultural collision before it happens. I had placed Calder Voss at table 7. Reasonable table, near enough to matter, far enough not to crowd the primary diplomatic cluster. I put 2 of our junior cultural advisors with him, a Velundran logistical aide, and 2 of the Velundran security personnel who were technically off duty for the evening. What I had not planned, what I could not have planned, because I hadn't known she would deviate from her assigned seating, was that Princess Siluran would decline her designated chair at the high table and quietly take the one empty chair at table 7 instead. I found out approximately 4 minutes after it happened, when Thessa appeared at my elbow and murmured, "The princess has changed her seat." I looked up, confirmed, revised my internal panic threat level upward. "Is she?" I started. "She appears interested in the civilian," Thessa said, "the quiet one." I looked at table 7. Calder Voss was not looking at the princess. He was looking at his food. He was cutting something very carefully and neatly with the focused attention of a man who was either completely unaware that he had been joined by interstellar royalty or was performing unawareness with extraordinary skill. "Has anyone briefed him on who she is?" I asked. Thessa considered this. "Unknown," she said. I closed my eyes briefly, opened them again. This was my life. I couldn't hear the conversation from where I stood. I'm going to tell you what happened at that table based on what I observed directly, what the princess's aide Thessa told me afterward, and much later, what Calder himself told me, in one of the very few extended conversations he and I had over the following months. What I observed, the princess sat down. Calder looked up from his food, registered her presence with the same mild calm he seemed to bring to every situation, and nodded once, the way you'd nod at a colleague sitting down in a cafeteria. The junior advisors at the table nearly choked simultaneously. The Velundran aides exchanged what I can only describe as a significant look. Calder went back to his food. What Thessa told me, the princess introduced herself as Siluran, no title, no formal designation. She asked Calder what he had been writing on his datapad throughout the working sessions. He told her he'd been making notes on Velundran communicative patterns, specifically the relationship between chromatic skin response and verbal emphasis, which he found mathematically interesting. She asked him to explain. He did, apparently without condescension, but also without any performative effort to impress her. She stayed at that table for the entire dinner, 3 hours. What Calder told me much later in his characteristically sparse way, she was interesting. I wasn't expecting that. I asked him if he'd known who she was. He said, by the 3rd sentence, yes. I asked him why he hadn't acknowledged her rank. He considered this for a moment. She didn't introduce herself with a rank, he said. Seemed rude to impose one. Part 2, what the VELUNDRANS could sense and we could not. After that first dinner, things shifted. Subtly, the way pressure changes before weather, you don't notice it exactly, but something in the air is different, and your body knows before your mind does. The diplomatic sessions continued. The high-level conversations about trade agreements and defensive cooperation proceeded in their careful, measured way. High Counselor Saln and Ambassador Maris continued their elaborate, courteous dance of incremental commitment. But underneath all of that, something else was developing. I watched it happen. I watched it the way you watch something grow, too slow to catch in any individual moment, visible only in the accumulation of small changes. The princess began positioning herself differently in the working sessions. She started requesting, through Thessa, always through Thessa, to be moved from the 3rd row to the 2nd. Then to a position along the side where she had a clear sightline to the full room, not the main table, not the primary diplomatic cluster, the side. From the side, she had a clear view of table-adjacent position 7A, which was where Calder Voss continued to sit, to the right and slightly behind the main human delegation, making notes on his datapad and occasionally leaning forward to say something quiet to the advisor beside him. I noticed this. I didn't say anything about it. Thessa began appearing at my side during recesses with small pieces of information, delivered in her quiet, careful way. The princess had questions about human cultural practices. The princess was curious about the role of civilian liaisons in human diplomatic structures. The princess wished to understand the specific academic background typically associated with the role of cultural analyst. Is the princess asking about the role generally, I said to Thessa on the fourth day, or about one specific cultural analyst? Thessa smiled. It was a very small smile. The princess asks thorough questions, she said. I did some digging on Calder Voss. Not formal research, I didn't have that kind of clearance for personnel files, but the informal intelligence gathering that every diplomatic attaché develops over years of work. Talking to the right people, asking adjacent questions. Listening to what wasn't said as much as what was. What I found was nothing clean, no clear narrative, just fragments that didn't quite connect. He had a university background, cultural anthropology and xenolinguistics, dual doctorate, completed about 12 years earlier. He'd spent several years doing field work, and here's where it got vague in contested space, which meant the boundary territories where human expansion had bumped up against other civilizations in ways that hadn't always been friendly. There were commendations in his non-military service record. I couldn't access the details, but the fact that a civilian cultural analyst had commendations at all was unusual. Commendations mean events. Events in contested space tend to mean trouble and what you do in trouble. His clearance level was significantly higher than his title suggested. I found that by accident, I was processing a document approval for one of our working sessions, and his name came up in an authorization chain at a tier that made me stop and read it twice. Third-tier cultural liaison doesn't sit in a tier 8 authorization chain. That's a simple fact. The numbers don't go there. But his name was there. I didn't pursue it. It wasn't my lane. I filed it in the same mental folder as the princess watching him and told myself it probably meant nothing. The folder was getting full. On the fifth day, something happened that I did see directly. We were mid-session, second hour. The energy in the room, the particular kind of tired that comes from extended careful politeness. When one of the Velundran junior security officers, a young male named Vethric, whom I'd noted as slightly high-strung throughout the mission, suddenly stood up from his position along the wall. He wasn't supposed to stand. Security personnel remain at positions during sessions unless there's an incident. The room noticed. Rooms full of diplomats are very sensitive to disruptions of established pattern. Vethric's skin had gone a complicated color, mottled between amber and pale gray, which in Velundran chromatics indicates agitation mixed with fear. His eyes were fixed on the environmental systems panel near the ceiling on the south wall. There is a cascade fault in the atmospheric regulation, he said, in Velundran, which Thessa immediately translated. Sector 4 through 7, if it propagates. He didn't finish the sentence because everyone in the room who understood atmospheric regulation on a spacecraft understood what came after if it propagates. A cascade fault in atmoreg means you have somewhere between 4 and 12 minutes before the atmospheric balance in the affected sectors becomes hazardous for biological life. We had 37 beings in that room who required specific atmospheric parameters to remain conscious. The room went from careful diplomatic calm to controlled emergency in about 4 seconds. I was moving toward the emergency panel on the east wall, running the protocol in my head: initiate manual override, seal the sector, activate backup atmo generators, when I registered that Calder Voss was already at the panel. He had gotten there before anyone else in the room. I don't know how. I hadn't seen him move. One moment he was in his chair. The next moment he was at the panel, and his hands were moving across it with the rapid, precise confidence of someone who has run this specific emergency protocol before. Not someone who is reading the instructions. Someone who has done this. He initiated the sector seal. The backup generators kicked with a sound like a low-held breath finally releasing. The environmental readouts stabilized, climbed back to safe parameters held. The whole process took 47 seconds. 47 seconds from fault detection to stable resolution. I stood 3 meters away and watched his hands on that panel and thought, that's not how a civilian cultural analyst moves in an emergency. When it was done, Calder stepped back from the panel. He looked at the readouts for a moment, confirming the numbers, checking his work the way you double-check something important. And then he turned back toward the table and said, in a completely normal voice, the backup system will hold for about 4 hours. You'll want to get engineering on the primary fault before then. And then he sat back down. He picked up his datapad. He made a note on it. The room was very, very quiet. I found Thessa afterward in the corridor. The princess, I said carefully. What did she do during the incident? Thessa was quiet for a moment. She watched him, she said, her inner eyes. Were they? Very bright, Thessa said. Very bright, yes. I thanked her and went to find a quiet corner to think. That night, very late, I was passing through Corridor 7 on my way back to my quarters from a documentation review session. It was quiet, the second shift, most of the ship asleep. The corridor displays were running their slow overnight cycle, showing astronomical imagery from each of the 12 worlds. I almost didn't notice them. They were sitting in one of the alcoves. The corridor has these wide alcoves with observation windows, designed for exactly this kind of pause, this kind of quiet. The princess and Calder, side by side, not touching, both looking out at the stars. They were talking, low enough that I could hear the murmur of voices but not the words. Calder's voice, then Silaran's, then Calder's again. Back and forth with the easy, unhurried rhythm of people who have somehow already found a way to talk to each other that doesn't require performance. The princess's skin in the dim corridor light was a color I hadn't seen on her before. Not the careful neutral violet she maintained in diplomatic settings. Something warmer, something softer at the edges with a faint gold underlayer. I know enough Velundran chromatics to know what gold means. I kept walking. I did not slow down. I looked straight ahead. I did not sleep well that night. Part 3, the thing that happened on the 7th day. By the 6th day, the diplomatic sessions had achieved enough momentum that everyone could feel the outlines of an actual agreement beginning to form. High Counselor Saln and Ambassador Maris were still being careful, still being measured, but the measurements were getting smaller. The gaps between positions were narrowing. Everyone was cautiously optimistic in the way that experienced diplomats allow themselves to be cautious about optimism. I was managing approximately 40 concurrent logistical tasks, and trying to ignore the fact that my instincts were telling me something large was building underneath the surface of everything. On the evening of the 6th day, Thessa found me and told me with her characteristic quiet precision that the princess wished to speak with me privately, at my earliest convenience. My earliest convenience was 23 minutes later, in the small side office I'd claimed for my documentation work. Silaran entered alone. Thessa waited outside. The Princess of Velundra was approximately 30 centimeters taller than me, which meant I was looking up at her in a way that required a certain amount of deliberate dignity on my part. Her skin was the careful neutral violet of formal interaction, but as she settled into the chair across from my desk, I saw the edges shift, just slightly, just at the periphery, toward something that wasn't quite neutral. "You are the protocol attaché," she said. Her standard was formal but fluent. Velundrans invest heavily in language acquisition. "Yes, I stopped. She hadn't introduced herself with a title. "Yes, that's my role." She looked at me for a moment, those inner eyes very calm, very attentive. "I want to ask you about the human," she said. "Calder Voss." I kept my expression neutral, professional. "Of course, what would you like to know?" "What is he?" she said. It was an interesting way to phrase it. Not who is he, what is he? "He's listed as a civilian cultural liaison," I said, "attached to the ambassador's staff for this mission." "I know what the manifest says," the princess said. There was no impatience in her voice. Just the calm precision of someone correcting an assumption. "I am asking what he is actually." I held her gaze. "I'm afraid I don't have access to information beyond." "He resolved an atmospheric cascade fault in 47 seconds, she said. "The standard response time for a trained systems engineer is 4 to 6 minutes. He was in the right position before the alarm had fully sounded. He executed the protocol from memory without reference to the panel guide." She paused. "His resonance imprint," she added quietly, "is unlike any human I have encountered." I was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean, his resonance imprint?" She considered her answer carefully. "Most beings, when we encounter them in contexts of stress or emergency, show a corresponding emotional response. Fear, adrenaline, the particular quality that survival instinct produces." She paused. "Calder Voss, during a shipboard emergency that threatened the lives of 37 beings, including 2 members of my house, produced an imprint of complete calm, not performed calm, not suppressed fear, genuine calm." She stopped. "The only beings I have encountered with that imprint signature are veteran soldiers of the most extreme experience, and even they usually carry some residue." The office was very quiet. "He carries no residue," she said. I didn't say anything for a long moment. "I can try to make inquiries," I said finally, "through appropriate channels." "Please," she said. And then, quietly, as she stood, "He told me last night that the stars near the Vethric border look like a specific constellation visible from his home city. He knew the stellar drift correction needed to calculate the view without a navigation tool." She paused at the door. "That is not something a cultural linguist learns." She left. I sat in my office for a while, looking at the wall. I didn't find out much through appropriate channels. What I found was what I'd found before: a file that was thin where it should have been thick, clearances that didn't match the title, commendations without detail. The file had been reviewed and reclassified at least twice in the past 5 years. The reclassifications were authorized at a command tier I had no business even looking at. What I did find, buried in a supplemental cultural service record that someone had apparently decided was too boring to fully redact, was a single operational reference. 3 words, a designation. VATHRIC Watch, Architect. I didn't know what that meant, not then. I made a note of it and kept it to myself. The 7th day was supposed to be a rest day. These are built into extended diplomatic missions for good reason. Sustained high-level negotiation is exhausting in ways that compound, and tired diplomats make mistakes. Everyone was meant to have the day for personal recreation, cultural exchange in informal settings, rest. I was in the secondary observation deck in the late morning, genuinely off-duty, which was rare enough to feel slightly surreal, when I heard the alert. Not the ship's general alarm, the ship's security alert, which is a different sound, a lower tone, more focused. It means something specific, a threat assessment, not an accident, not a system fault, a threat. I moved toward the nearest comm panel and identified myself as a diplomatic staff member, which got me enough information to understand the rough shape of what was happening. 3 beings had boarded the Ethon's Reach through an emergency docking junction on the ship's lower port side. The junction was supposed to be sealed. It wasn't. The 3 beings were Karvith, a species I knew of but had never encountered directly, associated in the intelligence briefs with various factions of what the Alliance called the contested opposition. Not quite soldiers, not quite criminals. Something in between. They were armed with tech that shouldn't have been on this vessel, which raised immediate questions about how they'd gotten past the departure scans. Their trajectory through the ship, which security was tracking via the internal sensor grid, was not toward any system's access point or sensitive technical area. It was toward the corridor that connected the guest quarters where the Velundran delegation, including the princess, was housed. I heard this and I started moving, not toward safety, away from it, toward the corridor in question, because my job is to protect the people in my care, and my body doesn't always wait for my brain to catch up with the math on that. I got to the junction between Corridor 12 and the Velundran guest wing in approximately 4 minutes, slightly out of breath. I'm not a young man. What I found when I arrived: Calder Voss standing at the corridor junction. Alone. The 3 Karvith beings were on the floor. All 3 of them. They were alive, I could see that, the slight movements of breathing, but they were thoroughly, comprehensively incapacitated. Disarmed. Positioned with their hands where security could see them the moment they arrived. 2 of them had restraint cuffs that I was relatively certain were not standard ship's issue, which meant Calder had produced them from somewhere on his person. The 3rd had been propped against the wall in the careful way that you place an unconscious person when you're concerned about their medical state. Calder was crouching next to that 3rd one, checking pulse points, doing a rapid field medical assessment with the same focused, economical manner he brought to everything. He had a small cut above his left eyebrow. That was his only visible damage. I stood at the corridor junction and stared. He looked up and saw me. "Security's been alerted," he said. "Yes, I managed." "Good." He stood up, glanced at the other 2, seemed satisfied with what he saw. The one against the wall hit his head. He'll need medical attention before interrogation. The other 2 are fine. He paused. Their weapons are on the floor behind me. Don't touch the tall ones. It's got a hair trigger and the safety's from a different model. I looked at the weapons, then back at him. "Are you?" I started. "Fine," he said. The cut looks worse than it is. I thought of 30 different questions and couldn't get any of them out. The princess, I said finally, is she? In her quarters with Thessa, I told them to stay inside before I came down here. He tilted his head. You should let them know it's resolved. The ship's security team arrived 40 seconds later, 6 officers in tactical configuration. They took in the scene. They took in the 3 incapacitated Carveth. They took in Calder Voss with the cut above his eye and the calm expression of someone who has finished a task. The security lead, a senior officer named Previsk whom I'd worked with before, stood very still for a moment. Sir, she said to Calder, in the tone that someone uses when they're revising their understanding of a situation very rapidly. Your medical team should look at the one on the left, Calder said. The others are secure. He walked past her, back toward the main corridor. After a moment I followed. I caught up to him outside the medical bay, where he'd apparently stopped to allow a medic to clean the cut on his forehead. He was sitting on a bench, holding a compress to his eyebrow, looking entirely unperturbed. I sat down next to him. What is Vethric Watch Architect? I said. He looked at me for a moment, the dark eyes very still, very attentive. Where did you find that? He said. Cultural Service record, supplemental file. Someone got lazy with the redactions. He made a small sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been something else. It's a project designation, he said. For what? He was quiet for a moment. For a period of work in the contested border territories, about 9 years ago. He paused. I helped establish the early warning and response protocols for the Vethric border stations, the ones that exist now. I thought about what that meant. The Vethric border. 9 years ago, the Vethric border had been, there's no gentle way to say this, a disaster. A series of incidents that had almost collapsed the first wave of human-alien diplomatic contact entirely. The resolution of those incidents, the stabilization of the border territories, was considered one of the foundational achievements that had made the current diplomatic era possible. You helped establish the protocols, I said. Helped, he said. It was a team. What did you specifically do? The pause was longer this time. Whatever was needed, he said. Part 4, what the princess decided. After the corridor incident, things happened faster. Not the diplomacy that kept its careful, measured pace, but the thing underneath the diplomacy, the thing I'd been watching develop since the first dinner. I found Thessa in the corridor the morning of the 8th day. Before I could say anything, she said quietly, the princess asked about him. After, what did you tell her? I told her what I had observed, Thessa paused, which was the same thing I'm sure you observed. And what did she say? Thessa was quiet for a moment. She said, he knew we were there and he went to protect us before the security team had even been alerted. I didn't say anything. She also said, Thessa continued in a slightly different tone, his resonance imprint when he came back was the same as before, completely calm, as if the entire event cost him nothing. Is that, I started. She said that it concerned her, and also that it did not. Thessa glanced at me. She said, a man who can walk through danger and return to calm this quickly is either deeply broken or the most genuinely centered being I have ever encountered. His imprint carries no darkness, only stillness. She paused. She said she has never encountered that before. On the 9th day, the princess asked to speak with Ambassador Maris. Through Thessa, formally, with proper title acknowledgement. That request sent the diplomatic staffs of both delegations into a careful kind of quiet frenzy. Scylla and Vel had been operating in observer status. Her formally requesting a meeting with the lead human ambassador was a protocol step of significant implication. The meeting was held in the smaller conference room with minimal staff. I was there because I'm always there. Thessa was there for the princess. Ambassador Maris had his deputy and his chief advisor. Calder was not there. The princess was direct. She had, I think, decided to dispense with the incremental approach. I am aware, she said, that the alliance under discussion is a framework agreement, cultural, trade, and limited defensive cooperation. She paused. I would like to propose an additional element. Ambassador Maris waited with very good composure. A bonding accord, she said, between our houses, between myself, as second heir of the sovereign house of Velundra and a representative of the human leadership structure. The room absorbed this. Ambassador Maris said very carefully, "Your Highness, this is an unexpected addition to the agenda." "I know," she said. "I am aware of the political weight of such a proposal. I raise it not as a condition of the broader agreement, but as a complement to it." "A deepening," she paused. "A bonding accord between our peoples at the level of house is, in Velundran tradition, more binding than a treaty. It is not undertaken lightly." "No," he agreed. "No, it certainly isn't." "I raise it now," she said, "because I believe there is a human who would be a suitable party to such an accord." Another pause. "And because I am aware that I may not have many more opportunities to raise it before this mission concludes." Maris looked at his deputy. His deputy had the expression of someone rapidly calculating an enormous number of variables. "May I ask," Maris said slowly, "which human you have in mind?" The princess folded her hands. "Calder Voss," she said. "I will tell you what I know about what happened in the 48 hours after that meeting, because it requires some explanation of things I didn't witness directly." Ambassador Maris did not immediately respond to the princess's proposal. He thanked her, expressed the appropriate gravity and respect, and said he would need to consult internally before providing any response. Internally meant a very intense and private conversation with his senior staff, his chief diplomatic advisor, and through a secured channel, someone at a command level that I don't have access to. What I know is that the call to that command level came back with a response in less than 6 hours. That is extremely fast. That is cleared the top of the queue fast. That is the kind of response time that happens when someone at the other end of the channel recognizes a name and immediately understands the implications. Maris had Calder in his office for approximately 90 minutes. "I don't know what was said. I've tried to find out. I can't find out. What I know is that Calder left the ambassador's office and went to his quarters. He was quiet for the rest of that day, but then again, he was usually quiet, so there was no reliable way to read the difference. The following morning, he asked through Maris's office to speak with the princess. They met in the observation alcove, corridor 7, the same one where I'd seen them talking at midnight 9 days earlier. I didn't observe this meeting. I only know it happened because Thessa told me, and because I saw them both afterward. What Thessa told me, Calder asked to speak with the princess directly, without intermediaries. He told her that the ambassador had presented him with her proposal. He told her that he didn't know how much she had been told about him, and that before she made any formal commitment, she should know more than the manifest said. He told her about the border territories. Thessa got this second-hand, from Siluran, so it came through 2 layers of translation, but the shape of it was this: 9 years in contested space, establishing protocol systems in situations that were not resolved diplomatically, doing things that couldn't be done any other way. Coming back changed, and then, and this is the part Thessa emphasized, coming back further, into something quieter than the change, finding his way back to stillness. He told her that the title on his manifest was accurate in function if not in full description. He was, genuinely, a cultural analyst. It was what he'd chosen to do when he stopped doing the other things. It was what gave him something to build instead of something to protect. He told her that he wasn't what a princess should probably marry. The princess apparently considered this for a long moment. Then she said, "What I can sense in your resonance is not what you just described. What you just described is what you did. What I can sense is what you are." And then Thessa's account here was quiet and careful, like she was handing me something delicate. Siluran said, "What you are is exactly what I have been waiting to find." Part 5, the wedding and what I witnessed. I want to be clear about something. A bonding accord between a Velundran princess and a human is not a small ceremony with folding chairs and a receiving line. It took 4 months to arrange. 4 months of coordination between Velundran cultural authorities, human diplomatic representatives, the sovereign empress of Velundra, who I did not meet and whose response to her daughter's choice I can only infer from the fact that it proceeded, and about 40 other parties whose roles I only partially understood. The Ethon's Reach mission concluded successfully. The Alliance Framework Agreement was signed on the 43rd day, and everything subsequent happened on different ground. The ceremony itself was held on Velundra Prime. I was included in the human delegation for the event, which I take as one of the greater honors of my professional life. Velundra Prime is, I don't have adequate words. I'll use inadequate ones. It's a world that seems to have been designed by beings who understand beauty as a functional principle rather than a decorative one. The capital city, Velundranthas, is built along the arc of a mountain range that curves toward a violet sea, and the architecture doesn't so much sit on the landscape as grow from it. That morning, the morning of the ceremony, the light came from two of Velundra's three suns simultaneously, the smaller one slightly above the horizon while the larger was still climbing, and the combined light on the iridescent city buildings produced a color I genuinely cannot name. Not one I'd seen before, not one I've seen since. There were approximately 12,000 beings in attendance, representatives of all 12 conclave worlds, the full court of Velundra, which is itself several hundred people, the human delegation of 60, and several thousand Velundran citizens who had gathered in the public spaces around the ceremony site, which was an open-air complex at the highest point of the city, a platform of pale stone surrounded by sky on three sides and the mountain behind. I was positioned about 40 meters back from the main ceremony space, in the section designated for supporting diplomatic staff. I had a clear view. The princess entered from the mountain side. Velundran ceremony tradition brings the principle from the high ground. It's symbolic, something about descent from the eternal heights to the living world. She wore the bonding raiment of her house, which is a kind of structured garment in deep blue-violet that incorporates light-channeling elements, not decoration, actual functional light-channeling materials woven into the fabric that shift with her chromatic expression. In the double sunlight of that morning, she was something beyond description. Her inner eyes were at full luminescence, the kind of brightness that I'd been told Velundrans reserve for their highest moments of genuine emotional response. She walked the approach path with the formal measured pace of Velundran ceremony, and 12,000 beings made a sound like one collective held breath. Calder came from the eastern side. He was wearing a human formal suit, dark, well-made, carefully pressed, no decorations, no insignia, nothing that would identify him as anything beyond what the manifest said he was. He walked at a normal pace, not the measured ceremony pace, his normal pace, which is quiet and unhurried and doesn't perform anything. He took his position across from her and looked at her. He didn't look at the 12,000 beings. He didn't look at the 6 conclave representatives in the front row. He didn't look at the Empress of Velundra, who was seated in the primary position to the left of the ceremony platform. He looked at Silaran, with the same calm, attentive quality he'd brought to everything from the moment I'd first noticed him at the wrong end of a diplomatic table. She looked back. Her skin, in that moment, I was 40 meters away, and I could see it clearly, shifted from the formal ceremony violet into something that moved through gold, through the warm amber-orange of deep happiness, and settled in a color I'd never seen in any reference material on Velundran chromatics. A color that made several of the Velundran courtiers near me make small, quiet sounds of recognition. I leaned toward Thessa, who was beside me. "What does that color mean?" I said quietly. She watched Silaran's skin for a moment. Then she said very softly, "We have a word for it. It translates approximately as the color of finding what you did not know you were looking for." She paused. "It is rare. I have seen it twice in my life, once when my mother's mother found her bonded partner, once before this." The ceremony proceeded. The formal words were in Velundran, with a standard translation running through the interpretive audio system available to the human delegation. The conclave officiants spoke the binding oaths. Oaths of genuine weight, because a Velundran bonding accord is not a symbolic gesture. It is a legal and spiritual and resonance-level commitment that Velundran law treats as one of the most serious acts a being can undertake. Calder repeated his oaths in Velundran, not read, recited from memory in precise, correct Velundran with the proper tonal register, because Velundran is a tonal language and the wrong tone changes the meaning entirely. The quiet that came from the Velundran attendees when he began speaking was different from the quiet before. It was the quiet of people who had not expected this. Silaran's skin, when he spoke the oaths, produced a brief flare of brilliant gold. He said the final words, she said the final words. The officiants performed the resonance binding. A Velundran ceremony element I'm not going to try to describe because my words for it are insufficient, and it was done. They were bonded. The reception afterward was the most extraordinary social gathering I have ever attended, and I am including in that assessment 67 prior diplomatic events, 3 royal galas, and a Cassivian spiritual festival that lasted 4 days. The Empress of Velundra, a being of somewhere around 500 standard years, skinned the deep royal violet that speaks of age and power combined, spoke with Calder for approximately 20 minutes in what appeared to be private conversation. I was too far away to hear. What I could see was the Empress's expression, which I'd describe as the careful assessment of someone revising a previously held opinion, and Calder's expression, which was the same as always, present, calm, not performing humility, not performing anything. At one point during that conversation, the Empress's skin shifted briefly, just for a moment, toward an amber gold. An expression of what Thessa, when I asked later, said was a quality similar to approval but older, more like recognition. I asked one of the Velundran cultural advisors what he thought of the bonding, diplomatically speaking. He was a small, careful male named Save, who had been in the Conclave Foreign Service for 40 years. He considered the question. "There is a tradition among our people," he said. "When a member of the sovereign house forms a bond, the resonance of that bond is considered a reflection on the health of the house, and by extension, the sovereignty." He paused. "The princess's resonance since the accord has a quality that our physicians describe as foundational, stable. The word implies a permanence." He looked toward the space where Siluran and Calder were standing together. She was talking with a conclave representative, and he was listening beside her with the comfortable ease of someone content to occupy adjacent space without demanding it. "The last time a member of the sovereign house produced that resonance quality was 240 years ago," Save said. "It's considered significant." I watched them across the reception room. The Princess of Velundra, luminous and ancient in her beauty, and the quiet human in the dark suit who had sat at the wrong end of a table and made notes on a datapad and said nothing that wasn't worth saying. "Did she ever ask," I said, "officially about what he was before the bonding?" Save tilted his head. "She told me once," he said, "that she didn't need the records to understand what she could sense. She said the resonance of a person is not made by their history, but by what their history has made of them." He paused. "She said his resonance spoke of something she could only call forged." Another pause. "She found it beautiful." Part 6, what came after, and what I finally understood. I saw them regularly over the following year. My role shifted. I became a senior protocol coordinator for the ongoing alliance development process, which meant I was frequently in proximity to the bonded pair as they took on their respective roles in the evolving human-Velundran relationship. Siluran became the principal Velundran liaison to the alliance framework body. She was extraordinary at it. The empathic sensitivity that made her a remarkable presence in ceremony translated into a capacity for reading diplomatic situations that her colleagues in the Velundran Foreign Service noted as exceptional even by their standards. Calder formally transitioned into a role that was more honest about what it actually involved. The title changed. I'm not going to put the new title in this document, because even now there are things I'm not authorized to fully disclose. What I can say is that he was involved in the design of several of the collaborative security protocols established under the Alliance framework, and that his name appeared, this time not buried in a supplemental file, in the acknowledgments of 3 foundational documents that established the early warning and response architecture of the 12-world conclave security system. The Vethric Watch, reborn in a new form for a new era. He built things, that's what he did at the core of it. He went to the places that needed building, and he built the framework that made safety possible. And then he stepped back and let other people operate what he'd built, because the building was what he cared about, and the recognition was not. I had one extended conversation with him, about 8 months after the bonding. We were both waiting for a session to begin, one of those 10-minute gaps where there's nothing to do but be in a room together, and it was the longest I'd ever heard him speak about himself, which means it was still not very long by most people's standards. I told him I'd done more research since I'd found the designation in his file, that I had a clearer picture now. He didn't ask what picture, he just waited. "Vethric border 9 years ago," I said. The incident at Station 12. He was quiet for a moment. Among other things, he said. There were 460 beings on Station 12, I said, when the contested opposition faction disabled the defensive grid. He looked at the wall. The official report, I said carefully, says the defensive grid was restored by a technical team that arrived 6 hours after the initial breach. I paused. But the testimonies from the station personnel, the ones that are public, describe a period of about 4 hours between the breach and the team's arrival, during which someone held the access point. He didn't say anything. One person, I said, alone for 4 hours. He turned his head and looked at me, those dark, attentive eyes. 4 hours and 14 minutes, he said, but who's counting? I waited. The technical team needed to reach the grid, he said quietly. Someone needed to make sure they could get there. He paused. It seemed like the relevant thing to do. 460 people, I said. He shrugged slightly, not dismissively, the shrug of someone who has made peace with the mathematics of a thing a long time ago. The team did the work, I just kept the door open. I thought about the corridor on the Ethan's reach. 3 Carveth on the floor and Calder crouching next to the unconscious one to check his pulse points. The cut above his eye that looked worse than it was. Does she know, I said, Silaran the full of it? He was quiet for a long moment. She knows what she can sense, he said finally, and she knows what I've told her, which is most of it by now. He paused. The details matter less to her than he stopped, searched for the word, which was unusual because he was normally precise. She said once that she can sense the shape of what something cost in a person's resonance. He looked at the wall again. She said she could sense what it cost me, what those years cost. Another pause. She said she loves me because of what I built after. I didn't say anything for a while. She's a remarkable person, I said finally. Yes, he said simply, completely. She is. There's one more thing I want to tell you. About 2 years after the bonding, there was an event at the Conclave Assembly, one of the large formal gatherings, all 12 worlds represented at the highest levels. I was part of the human delegation. The Ethan's Reach veterans were there in significant numbers, which gave the whole event a quality of reunion alongside its diplomatic weight. At one point during the opening ceremony, there was a presentation, a formal acknowledgement of contributions to the Alliance framework. Names were read, roles were cited. When Calder's new designation was read, his real designation, the one that reflected what he'd actually been doing for 12 years, the Velundran section of the assembly produced a sound. Not applause. Velendrans don't applaud the same way humans do. They produce a resonance tone, a sound made by some biological mechanism I still don't fully understand, that signals communal acknowledgement. It can range from perfunctory to profound depending on what's being acknowledged. The tone that rose from the Velundran assembly when Calder's name was read was, I asked Save about this afterward, because I wanted to name it correctly, the tone reserved for what they call a Velanthrek. A living legend. Not a legend in the sense of fame, a legend in the sense of a person whose actions have become woven into the structural fabric of how things are now. The border is secure because of what was done there. The alliance exists in part because the ground was prepared. The world is shaped differently than it would have been, and the person who shaped it is standing in the room. Save said it's a sound that's produced maybe 3 times in a generation. Calder was standing in the human section of the assembly when the tone rose. He heard it. He knew what it meant. He spoke Velundran after all. He didn't change his expression. He looked across the assembly floor, through the space between the delegations, to where Silaran was standing in the Velundran section. She was already looking at him. Her skin, from across the room, had shifted to that color I still can't name. The one Thessa had translated as finding what you did not know you were looking for. They looked at each other for a moment, just a moment. Then Calder smiled. A real smile, one of the rare ones, the ones that changed his face completely, and Silaran's skin went gold. I have thought about this story many times since then, tried to understand what it means, what the through line is, what it's actually about. Here's what I've arrived at, after all the time I've had to think about it. The princess married a quiet man. A man who sat at the wrong end of tables and made notes on data pads and didn't volunteer information about himself and didn't need to be the most important person in any room. She didn't know, not fully, not in the beginning, that the quiet was built on something enormous. That the stillness was the thing you arrive at after going through everything that requires noise and fire and held doors in the dark. She knew what she could sense. She trusted what she could sense. And what she could sense was that his resonance was genuine, not performed, not worn as armor, but real in the way that something is real when it's been earned rather than assumed. She didn't marry a legend, she married a man. It turned out he was both. My name is Corvan D. Hess. I served as third-tier protocol attaché for 11 years and senior protocol coordinator for 7 more. I attended more diplomatic events than I can count. I managed seating arrangements for beings from 12 different worlds. I have been asked to tell this story many times. To colleagues, to juniors learning the profession, to the occasional journalist who gets close enough to the real history to ask the right questions. I tell it the same way every time. Because the part that matters, the part I want people to understand, isn't the border station. It isn't the Vethric watch. It isn't the 3 Carveth on a corridor floor or the 47 seconds of perfect emergency response or the fact that a man learned Velundrin well enough to speak the bonding oaths from memory. The part that matters is a midnight corridor and 2 people looking at stars. The part that matters is a princess asking what is he and a man who answered honestly, even when honest was complicated. The part that matters is a woman who could sense the shape of what something costs, and who chose, with all the accumulated wisdom of her extraordinary species and her remarkable heart, to love what came after.